August 15th, 1945. The war in the Pacific had finally collapsed beneath the weight of surrender. With Emperor Hirohito's broadcast echoing across the islands, American forces swept into Japanese-held territories to secure prisoners, gather intelligence, and restore order. No one knew that on this day, behind the rusted gates of a forgotten military outpost in the Philippines, they would uncover one of the most haunting human tragedies of the entire war. It was a discovery that would change not only the fate of 48 broken women, but also the very philosophy of trauma recovery in the years to come. The morning air was thick with humidity, as 23-year-old Soon Ok pressed her face against the barred window of the makeshift barracks. She watched the silhouettes of American soldiers marching through the compound, their boots striking the dirt with controlled precision. She had survived more than 3 years of captivity, but freedom still felt unreal, like a story whispered by someone else. For her and the other women inside, hope had always felt like an enemy that betrayed them too early. Captain James Mitchell of the 101 Stones Airborne stepped through the courtyard with a practiced soldier's gaze. He had seen death on jungle trails, starvation in captured villages, and the aftermath of massacres across the Pacific. But nothing prepared him for the soft whimper he heard as he pushed open the warped wooden door of the barracks behind the main installation. The smell of fear hit him first, then silence, then dozens of eyes staring back at him, hollow and frightened as if expecting punishment. The women recoiled instinctively, shrinking into corners, clutching torn blankets around their fragile bodies. Some tried to hide their faces. Others stared with a numbness so deep that even liberation could not reach them yet. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of the few female medical officers attached to the unit, knelt beside a Filipino woman named Maria Santos. Maria's shoulders shook uncontrollably. When Chen reached out, the young woman whispered, "Please, no hurt. Please, no more." Her voice cracked, fragile as a leaf crushed underfoot. That moment shattered whatever professional distance Lieutenant Chen had promised herself. She saw the bruises that never healed correctly, the wounds left untreated, the scars carved over years of systematic abuse. But what struck her more than the physical injuries was the emptiness in their eyes. It was the look of people who had forgotten how to expect kindness. The military response was chaotic. Soldiers argued among themselves. Should the women be taken to refugee camps, field hospitals, processing centers? No protocol existed for survivors of sexual slavery. Some commanders insisted they were simply displaced civilians. Others demanded interrogations for intelligence. The confusion cracked open old wounds for the women, who could not understand why strangers shouted around them. For days they remained inside the converted mess hall. American troops delivered food, water, medical kits, but the women still hesitated to speak, eat, or sleep. Mitchell watched all of it with growing frustration. War had taught him how to break enemy lines, not how to rebuild broken souls. A breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. Major Patricia Reeves, a psychiatric nurse known for tackling impossible cases, arrived on August 22nd. She studied the women quietly, observing every flinch, every hesitation, every instinctive recoil from touch. Reeves quickly realized that ordinary military treatment would only deepen their trauma. These were not simply victims of violence. They were survivors of a systematic machine designed to erase identities and crush humanity. Soon Ok gradually emerged as the group's unofficial spokesperson. Her Korean dialect mixed with broken Japanese and halting English created fragile bridges of communication. Through her trembling voice, Reeves learned of the forced name changes, the beatings for speaking native languages, the punishments for crying, and the terror of being treated as property. September 1st brought the first attempt at order as Reeves converted an abandoned officers' quarters into a temporary treatment center. Clean beds replaced filthy mats, fresh uniforms replaced ragged clothing, nutritious meals replaced scraps. Yet even in safety, the women walked as if any shadow might strike them. Kindness itself frightened them. Captain Mitchell found himself questioning everything he thought he understood about military duty. How did one restore dignity to women who had been punished for having any? How did one teach trust to people who learned that survival depended on submission? His training had no answers, and that terrified him more than enemy fire ever had. One moment changed the course of everything. During routine examinations, Lieutenant Chen noticed several women staring shyly at a small mirror left accidentally on a table. They glanced at their reflections, then looked away quickly, flinching as if expecting a blow. Soon OK explained through gestures that mirrors had been forbidden. Looking at themselves was punished. Caring for themselves was punished. Even acknowledging their own identity was punished. Reeves felt something shift inside her. She wrote in her notebook, "Identity destruction." They need a way to reclaim themselves. Healing must begin not with medicine, but with the rediscovery of self. That idea planted the seed of a revolutionary concept she would soon fight the entire military structure to implement. But as she prepared to present her plan, she had no idea how deeply it would challenge traditional thinking, or how fiercely the system would resist it. Outside, thunderstorms began rolling across the Philippine mountains. Inside the compound, another storm was gathering, one that would decide whether these women remained victims or began their long journey toward reclaiming their humanity. September 1st, 1945, settled over the Philippines with a humid stillness that felt unnatural after months of gunfire, air raids, and fear. The compound where the women were now sheltered sat quietly beneath tall coconut trees, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the newly repurposed officers' quarters, Major Patricia Reeves studied the survivors with an intensity sharpened by years of treating battlefield trauma. But nothing in her medical training prepared her for this. These women were not only wounded, they had been systematically unmade. The transformation of the quarters was swift. Clean sheets were placed over iron beds. Uniformed nurses disinfected the floors. Buckets of clean water replaced rusted cans. But when the first group of women stepped inside, they froze at the doorway. They whispered among themselves in a mix of Korean, Japanese, Filipino, and Mandarin. Lieutenant Chen gently encouraged them to enter. Still, they hesitated, their minds unable to accept that safety could exist without punishment. Inside, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a civilian psychiatrist who had rushed from Manila upon hearing of the discovery, waited with a notebook in hand. Her face softened as she watched the women cling together like terrified children. She recognized the signs instantly: cultural suppression, identity erasure, chronic subjugation. They had not merely been oppressed, they had been conditioned to exist in a world where they no longer belonged to themselves. Harper conducted the first assessments quietly, asking simple questions. What name do you prefer? Do you want water? Do you feel pain? But each question became a struggle. Many froze when asked their own names. Some whispered their Japanese names first, then corrected themselves with shaking voices. A few could not remember their Korean or Chinese names at all. One woman cried when asked where she was born, convinced she had answered incorrectly and would be punished. Reeves documented every reaction with growing alarm. She saw dissociation in their eyes, the drifting stare of people who had learned to detach their minds from their bodies to survive the unthinkable. Some women flinched at gentle touch. Others curled into themselves, as if bracing for blows. One collapsed into tears simply because Chen spoke to her kindly. Yet amidst all the suffering, one moment shifted everything. During a medical briefing, Chen placed a small hand mirror on the table. When she stepped aside, 3 women approached it cautiously. One peeked at her reflection for less than a heartbeat before recoiling in horror. Another raised her hand to cover her face. A third stared for several seconds, her lip trembling, then whispered something in Korean that broke Chen's heart. She translated quietly to Reeves. She said she does not know this woman. Reeves felt the room tilt. This was deeper than trauma. This was identity annihilation. She wrote in her journal that night, "Their bodies have survived the war. Their sense of self has not." The next days revealed more disturbing truths. Many of the women had internal injuries that had never healed. Some carried untreated infections. Others suffered from fainting spells caused by malnutrition. 18-year-old L.S. Mendoza, the youngest survivor, could barely speak above a whisper. She kept her hands folded tightly against her chest and stared at the floor as if it offered her the only safety she had ever known. Captain Mitchell visited daily, his uniform soaked with sweat from the oppressive heat. He tried to bring comfort, but every attempt left him feeling helpless. How could a soldier rebuild something so deeply broken? He prayed for leadership in moments where leadership had no manual. On September 8th, something unexpected happened. Soon OK approached Lieutenant Chen with a timid request. She tapped her chest, then pointed to the mirror. Then she shook her head violently and covered her face as if ashamed. Chen translated, "Softly. She says she feels like a shadow. She wants to see herself, but she is afraid of what she has become." That night, Reeves could not sleep. She replayed the moment again and again, the way Soon Ok's hands trembled, the way her voice cracked, and then the idea struck her with the force of revelation. Healing needed to begin with the restoration of identity. The women did not need only medical care. They needed to relearn who they were allowed to be. By the next morning, Reeves had composed a proposal to command. She stood before Colonel Hayes with her shoulders squared and her voice steady. The plan was bold. It involved something unheard of in military treatment protocols. A dignity restoration program focused on physical self-care, and at its core, something the military would surely dismiss: professional beauty treatments. Hayes stared at her in disbelief. He argued that the war was barely over, supplies were scarce, and soldiers were still recovering from their own battles. He accused her of wasting resources on vanity. Reeves held her ground. She explained that these treatments could rebuild self-worth, restore autonomy, and create a safe environment for survivors to relearn decision-making. But Hayes shook his head. His final words were cold. "We are here to repatriate them, not pamper them." Reeves left the meeting with her jaw clenched, her heart pounding. She had been dismissed, but she had not been defeated. She knew something the colonel did not. She had felt it in every trembling hand she held, every whisper of fear, every glance into that mirror. Identity was the battlefield that remained, and she intended to fight for it. September 10th, 1945, arrived with a sweltering heat that clung to every surface of the compound like a heavy blanket. The sun had barely risen, yet Major Patricia Reeves was already pacing beside the medical tents, her boots grinding into the loose gravel. Her proposal sat folded beneath her arm, creased from the number of times she had rewritten it. She had expected resistance, but she had not expected the sting of outright dismissal. The women needed far more than food and a bed to sleep on. They needed something that could rebuild the fractured pieces of identity torn from them during captivity. But the military leadership saw only a group of displaced civilians to be processed quickly and sent away. Reeves stared at the horizon with a simmering frustration. Behind her, the survivors were slowly emerging from their barracks. They moved quietly, their steps small and cautious, as though they had not yet earned the right to take up space. She watched them with a tightening in her chest. These women had lived through years of cruelty that killed the spirit before it ever touched the body. And yet, the system wanted to treat them like names on a form, not like human beings. Inside the command office, Colonel Hayes reviewed reports with a set jaw. He was a traditional officer shaped by traditional wars. Supplies were limited, morale was fragile, and the Pacific Theater still required stability. To him, Reeves's idea of a dignity restoration program seemed wasteful. Beauty treatments, mirrors, choice. He saw no place for such things in the discipline of military recovery. But Hayes had not seen what Reeves had. He had not sat with women who flinched at their own reflections. He had not listened to Soon OK describe her terror of choosing between a blue blanket and a white one, because she believed choosing wrongly would lead to punishment. He had not witnessed Maria Santos burst into tears simply because someone asked her what name she preferred. Reeves made her second approach through Lieutenant Sarah Chen, hoping that a woman's perspective might soften the resistance. Together, they presented the psychological reasoning behind the program. Reeves explained that traditional rehabilitation would fail because these women had been conditioned to obey without thinking. They needed a path back to autonomy, and physical self-care could offer a bridge. But Hayes remained unmoved. His expression stayed stone still as he dismissed the idea once again. Outside, events were unfolding that would unintentionally strengthen Reeves's argument. That morning, Sergeant Mario O'Sullivan, a Red Cross volunteer with years of experience as a hairdresser, heard frantic whispers coming from the latrine. She rushed inside and froze. 20-year-old Takako Yamamoto, whose Korean name was Park Hae-jin, stood trembling near a broken shard of glass. Her hair was tangled, matted, and cut unevenly where she had desperately attempted to remove knots by slicing through them. When O'Sullivan approached slowly, Hae-jin backed into the corner, shaking violently. Tears streaked down her face. She muttered in a mix of Korean and Japanese, her voice rising in despair. Through Chen's translation, O'Sullivan learned the truth. Hae-jin believed she looked monstrous. She'd been punished so many times for her appearance that she could not bear to see her reflection anymore. She wanted to cut away the reminders of who she had become. The incident shook the entire medical team. Reeves stood in the doorway watching Hae-jin sob uncontrollably, her shoulders heaving with years of swallowed pain. In that moment, Reeves felt her determination tighten like a steel cable. This was not vanity. This was dignity. This was survival. Chen gently guided Hae-jin back to her bed, whispering soothing words, while O'Sullivan wrapped the shard of glass in cloth. Reeves stepped into the courtyard, the late morning sun beating against her back. She walked straight to the command office once. More. This time, she did not ask. She demanded. She stood before Colonel Hayes with the force of someone who had run out of patience for excuses. She described the latrine incident detail by detail. The broken glass, the shaking hands, the attempted self-harm, the fear of a mirror. She told him these women did not need luxury. They needed a chance to rediscover their own humanity. Hayes stared at her for a long moment, the tension between them thick enough to silence the entire room. He finally exhaled and rubbed his temples. "I will consider it," he said. It was not approval, but it was not dismissal either. Reeves took it as the first crack in a rigid wall. Over the next days, she gathered evidence, medical reports, and testimonies from the team. Dr. Harper wrote a detailed psychological analysis describing the need for identity reconstruction. Lieutenant Chen documented the women's reactions to mirrors and choices. O'Sullivan wrote a personal report describing Hae-jin's near breakdown. Reeves collected everything like ammunition. On September 15th, she presented her expanded formal proposal. Her voice never trembled as she spoke. When she finished, silence lingered in the command room. For a moment, she feared they would reject her again. Then Hayes cleared his throat. "If you can do it without compromising essential supplies, you may proceed on a trial basis." Reeves almost collapsed with relief. But even as she walked out with the first glimmer of victory, she had no idea of the larger storm approaching. Resistance still brewed among officers. Chaplains whispered concerns. Medical purists mocked the idea of beauty as therapy. And outside the compound, news of the survivors' suffering was beginning to spread through military channels. The world was about to change, and the arrival of one unexpected visitor would turn Reeves's fragile victory into a movement that could not be stopped. September 22nd, 1945, dawned with a restless wind moving across the Philippine hills. The compound buzzed quietly with early morning routines, unaware that history itself was about to walk through its gates. Major Patricia Reeves stood on the balcony of the converted officers' quarters, rereading her notes for the 100th time. Her pilot program had been approved in theory, but remained fragile in practice. Opposition simmered like heat trapped beneath metal roofing. Chaplains argued morality. Commanders argued logistics. Some soldiers scoffed at the idea entirely. Reeves felt as though she were building a bridge out of thin air, hoping it would hold the weight of dozens of wounded souls. Down in the courtyard, the survivors moved between the shade of the trees and the benches near the water barrels. Their steps were still small, guarded, uncertain. Maria Santos sat with her knees tucked beneath her chin, listening to the distant humming of American generators with the same wary distrust that had marked her every movement since liberation. Soon okay, now an unspoken leader among the women, tried to comfort her with soft words in Korean, though both understood that their fears were rooted deeper than language. Captain Mitchell passed through the yard with his usual brisk stride, nodding gently to each survivor. He no longer saw a group of displaced civilians. He saw the hollow gaze of people who had endured the unendurable, and he saw how crucial Reeves's program was becoming. Every day the women made the smallest steps forward, yet their recovery remained a fragile flame that could be extinguished with the slightest harsh wind. That wind arrived in the form of military bureaucracy. Despite Hayes's reluctant approval, supply officers continued to deny requests. Mirrors were non-essential, hair combs were wasteful, even soap allocations were questioned. Reeves found herself writing report after report, pleading for basic items. It felt like fighting the war all over again, except this time the enemy was not armed with rifles but with paperwork and prejudice. And then the unthinkable happened. A jeep rolled into the compound with a flag no one expected to see. Soldiers straightened instinctively, hands snapping to their sides. Captain Mitchell blinked in disbelief. Lieutenant Chen covered her mouth. Even Colonel Hayes rushed from his office with a stunned look. Eleanor Roosevelt had arrived, the widow of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The woman who had shaped human rights discussions across continents now stepped onto the dusty Philippine ground, wearing a simple dress and a determined expression. She had come on a fact-finding mission to assess the treatment of displaced persons across the Pacific, but no one anticipated she would visit this obscure outpost. Word spread through the compound like a shockwave. Survivors peeked from the barracks, unsure of what such a powerful woman meant for them. Reeves felt her pulse quicken as she approached the First Lady, offering a respectful salute that Roosevelt immediately waved away with warm humility. "Please, Major," Roosevelt said softly. "I am here to listen, not to be honored." Reeves guided her into the quarters where the survivors rested. The room fell silent as the First Lady entered. The women watched her with wide, uncertain eyes. Some stood. Some pressed themselves against the walls. A few began to cry without knowing why. Roosevelt moved slowly between them, stopping beside Maria Santos, who trembled as she bowed her head. Instead of speaking, the First Lady knelt before her and gently took her hands. Tears spilled from Maria's eyes as if the simple touch had unlocked pain she had tried to bury. Roosevelt's voice broke when she whispered, "No one will hurt you again, not while the world is watching." Next, she approached 19-year-old Chen Wei-ming, the Taiwanese survivor who had endured some of the worst cruelty. When Wei-ming tried to speak, her voice collapsed into sobs. Roosevelt wrapped an arm around her shoulders and held her until she calmed, her own eyes shining. By the time the First Lady had walked the room, the medical staff were openly emotional. Even Colonel Hayes stood frozen, speechless. Every hesitation, every argument, every dismissive order seemed insignificant under the weight of her compassion. Roosevelt requested a private briefing. Inside the command hut, Reeves presented the full outline of the Dignity Restoration Program. She explained identity destruction. She explained the mirror incident. She explained He-Jin's breakdown. She explained the need for physical self-care as a gateway to psychological healing. Roosevelt listened in absolute silence. When Reeves finished, the First Lady leaned forward and spoke with a firmness that shook the room. These women were not only victims of war, they were victims of a systematic assault on their humanity. If we do not help them rebuild their sense of self, then liberation is only half complete. Major Reeves, your program is not cosmetic, it is essential. She turned to Colonel Hayes. Approve every request, immediately. Hayes swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, ma'am. The transformation was instantaneous. Supply officers suddenly discovered they had everything Reeves needed. The Red Cross redirected crates, originally meant for European officers' clubs. Portable salon equipment arrived within days. Professional-grade soap, brushes, combs, lotions, and hair supplies filled storage rooms that had once held ammunition. Sergeant Mario O'Sullivan was placed in charge of the new unit. Her skills as a civilian hairdresser were now seen as strategic assets. She recruited Corporal Janet Wong, a former nail technician, and Private First Class Anna Kowalski, trained in cosmetology. The team expanded with a sense of purpose none had expected when they first enlisted. Yet with new resources came new fears. When Reeves announced the creation of the Beauty Treatment Center, The survivors reacted with a mix of confusion and pure terror. Some interpreted it as a return to the horrors of the comfort stations. Others believed they were being prepared for punishment. A few refused to enter the converted mess hall where the Salon equipment was set up. Reeves knew the next step could either begin their healing or reopen their wounds. She prayed they would trust her, because the moment one woman stepped into that chair, the future of every survivor in the compound would change forever. October 8, 1945, arrived with a gentle breeze that rustled through the coconut trees surrounding the compound. The morning sky was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds that drifted lazily across the horizon. It was the kind of day that should have felt peaceful, but inside the newly prepared salon room, the air trembled with tension. Soldiers and medical staff stood ready, their tools laid out like instruments for a delicate surgery. They all knew today would mark either the beginning of a revolution in trauma care or a devastating failure that could shatter fragile trust forever. Kim Yong-suk stood at the doorway like a statue carved from fear and determination. At 18, she had endured more cruelty than most would in a lifetime. Her Korean name had nearly been beaten out of her, her identity crushed, her reflection forbidden. But something in her heart had shifted after Eleanor Roosevelt's visit. The First Lady's tears, her compassion, her promise of dignity had ignited a spark in the young survivor. Now she stepped forward, trembling but resolute, becoming the first to volunteer for the new program. Sergeant Mario O'Sullivan approached with slow, deliberate steps. Her voice was soft when she spoke, asking permission to touch, showing the comb, the scissors, the shampoo bottle. Lieutenant Sarah Chen translated every word, her hand resting lightly over Yong-suk's, offering reassurance. Despite this, Yong-suk's breathing was shallow, her shoulders tense, her eyes darting toward the exits. Every instinct in her body warned her to run. But she stayed. The salon chair, a strange contraption built from salvaged aircraft pieces and military canvas, creaked when she sat down. Her hands shook so violently she had to clasp them together to keep them from trembling off her lap. O'Sullivan knelt in front of her and whispered, "You are in control. You can stop this at any moment." Chen repeated the words in Korean, and tears filled Yong-suk's eyes, not from fear this time, but from the shock of hearing she had control over anything. O'Sullivan began with something simple, warm water. She gently poured it over the young woman's hair. The room fell silent. The water streamed down, carrying months of dust and despair with it. When O'Sullivan reached to apply the shampoo, Yong-suk flinched. Her entire body tensed as memories collided with the present. But Chen held her hand and spoke softly. Slowly, Yong-suk exhaled. The transformation began. As O'Sullivan massaged the soap into her hair, something shifted in the room. The women gathered near the door watched with wide eyes, as though witnessing a forbidden ritual. Some covered their mouths. One whispered a prayer. Another clasped her hands together as if witnessing a miracle. Tears slid down Yong-suk's cheeks. Not because of pain, but because the touch was gentle. Because no one barked orders. Because she was not struck for flinching. Because the hands that touched her now carried compassion, not cruelty. O'Sullivan washed and rinsed her hair with patient care. She used clean towels and warm water, wiping gently around the girl's face. Every small movement seemed to peel away layers of fear. The staff watched in awe. The survivors watched in fear and hope. Even Colonel Hayes, standing quietly in the corner, felt a knot form in his throat. He had never seen trauma unravel like this, and he realized Reeves had been right all along. Next came the haircut. O'Sullivan raised her scissors and showed them to Yong-suk. The girl nodded once. Her breathing steadied. Snip by snip, the uneven, matted strands fell to the ground. With each cut, her posture changed. Her shoulders lifted slightly. Her back straightened. She inhaled deeply, as though reclaiming air she had forgotten to breathe. When O'Sullivan finished, she stepped back and whispered, "Ready?" Yong-suk froze. The mirror sat covered nearby. The decision was hers. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached out and lifted the cloth. The room held its breath. When she finally saw her reflection, her lips parted, her eyes widened. She touched her hair, then her own face, as if confirming that the woman in the mirror was truly her. Tears spilled over again, But this time they were different. They were the tears of a soul rediscovering itself. She whispered something in Korean. Chen's voice broke as she translated. She said, "She looks human again." The words pierced every heart in the room. News of her transformation spread quickly across the compound. By midday, 3 more women had quietly approached O'Sullivan, pointing shyly to the chair. The demand grew so rapidly that Reeves had to assign a rotating schedule. Each woman entered the salon with fear and left with tears of relief. Some smiled for the first time in years. Others asked shyly for a ribbon or to choose a hairstyle. These small requests meant more than anyone could describe. They were acts of rebellion against the years when choice had been stolen from them. Maria Santos came in late afternoon. She had been among the most withdrawn survivors. Her steps were weak, but determination carried her forward. When Private First Class Rosa Martinez began speaking to her in Tagalog while styling her hair, Maria's stiff posture softened. She laughed once, a small laugh. The entire room froze. No one had heard that sound since her rescue. Dr. Harper recorded everything meticulously. She noted changes in heart rate, muscle relaxation, appetite and sleep patterns. For the first time, medical evidence supported what Reeves had believed all along. Dignity could heal wounds medicine alone could not reach. Yet not all reactions were joyful. Some women cried uncontrollably during sessions, releasing years of buried terror. Others asked heartbreaking questions. Will this make soldiers come again? Are we being prepared for punishment? Do we deserve to look nice? Each question carved new scars into the hearts of the staff. Still, the program grew. And, as it did, the survivors' eyes began changing. The haunted emptiness slowly gave way to flickers of life, hope, color, humanity returning to faces that had forgotten how to hold it. But healing always uncovers deeper wounds, and soon the program would trigger memories and truths that none of them were prepared to face. October 22nd, 1945, arrived with warm sunlight stretching across the compound, illuminating the growing line of survivors waiting outside the makeshift salon. What had begun with Kim Yong-suk's trembling courage had evolved into a daily ritual of transformation. Each woman who sat in the salon chair emerged, changed, even if only slightly, as if the act of choosing a hairstyle or a scent of soap stitched together a piece of their broken identities. But healing is never a straight path, and in the quiet hours between sessions, the staff began noticing shadows behind the progress. Inside the salon, Sergeant Mario O'Sullivan hummed softly as she arranged brushes and combs. Corporal Janet Wong prepped a small table for nail treatments while Private First Class Anna Kowalski filled basins with warm water. The atmosphere was lighter now, warmer, the air thick with the faint scent of lavender oil the Red Cross had sent. But beneath the smiles and relieved sighs lingered a truth Reeves recognized all too well. When trauma loses its chains, it begins to speak. Chen Wei-Ming was the first to break open. During her third salon session, as Corporal Wong gently painted her nails, something in the soft rhythm triggered a memory she had buried so deeply she believed it lost forever. Suddenly she began speaking rapidly in Taiwanese, then Japanese, then English, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and revelation. She described her village, her mother singing near the river, a red hair ribbon she once loved. The day soldiers came. Her words tumbled out like a dam cracking open. Wong paused, tears gathering as she listened. Reeves quickly arrived, notebook in hand, documenting every detail while ensuring Wei Ming remained safe. But the breakthrough had a cost. The next morning, Wei Ming woke screaming, shaking uncontrollably, terrified of shadows that reminded her of the station she had been kept in. Reeves realized the truth. The salon had unlocked memories long suppressed. Healing had opened the door to pain that survival had forced them to hide. Another woman, Park Hae-jin, suffered an even more frightening episode. During what should have been a simple trim, the sight of scissors glinting near her neck triggered a violent panic. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her head, screaming in 3 languages at once. It took 4 people to steady her. When Chen finally reached her, she discovered that one captor had used scissors as a threat, pressing the blades against Hae-jin's throat whenever she resisted. The association was so strong that even the soft snip of hair scissors sent her spiraling into terror. The incident devastated the staff. O'Sullivan blamed herself. Wong cried quietly afterward, shaken by how quickly fear had consumed the woman. Reeves knew this was the price of progress. Healing demands confronting shadows. But she also knew the staff needed support. Secondary trauma was affecting them all. Some soldiers asked for reassignment. Others struggled to sleep after listening to the women's stories. As if the emotional strain were not enough, Lieutenant Chen made a heartbreaking discovery while reviewing old medical notes. Several women had signs of pregnancies that had ended through either forced abortions or miscarriages. Some bore surgical scars. Others carried silent grief in their eyes. These losses added another layer to their trauma, a pain so private that many could not speak of it. Reeves expanded the treatment program immediately. Art therapy was added, allowing the women to express memories through drawing or color. Music therapy was introduced, where survivors sang songs from their homelands with trembling voices that slowly grew stronger. Cultural sessions allowed them to practice traditional crafts, lace weaving, embroidery, or folding paper flowers. These small acts restored pieces of heritage that captivity had tried to erase. Yet the darkest storm approached not from memory, but from the outside world. In early November, letters began arriving through Red Cross channels. Survivors gathered around Lieutenant Chen as she read the messages aloud. Some women hoped for reunion, others prayed for acknowledgement, but the truth waiting inside those envelopes was colder than any cruelty the Japanese army had inflicted. The first letter belonged to Soon OK. Chen's voice faltered as she translated her brother's words. He wrote that their family believed she had died honorably. To learn she had lived as a comfort woman would bring shame. He asked her not to return. Soon OK's face drained of color. Her body swayed. Then she folded to the floor, her sobs wrenching through the room. She refused food for days. She would not speak. She turned her face to the wall and whispered the same sentence again and again. I should have died. Her despair infected the others. More letters arrived. Many held the same message. Do not come home. You are polluted. You will bring dishonor. Better to remain lost. The women who had begun standing taller after their Salon sessions now crumbled beneath the weight of rejection. The progress made in weeks seemed to unravel in hours. Some tore their letters apart. Others clutched them to their chests, crying silently. Several attempted to return to their barracks and refused to leave. The compound was filled with grief that no medicine could soothe. Dr. Harper realized they needed a new form of therapy, a plan that looked not only backward to trauma, but forward to survival. She called it social reintegration therapy. The goal was not to return the women to families who rejected them. It was to help them build new identities, new skills, and new futures. Vocational training began. Typing lessons, basic bookkeeping, nursing assistant courses, even beauty therapy itself. The irony was not lost on Reeves. The very practices once used to control them would now become tools of liberation. Through all this, one woman emerged as a quiet leader, Maria Santos, who had once hidden her face behind her knees, now helped comfort those receiving painful letters. She sat beside them through the night, whispering, "Your worth is not given by others. We will build something new." But even as the survivors began learning to imagine new futures, the world outside was shifting. Their testimonies were being requested for upcoming war crimes trials. Their stories were needed, their voices demanded, their courage essential. Yet courage comes at a cost. And soon, women would discover that healing was only the first step in a much longer battle for justice, identity, and a place in a world that had not yet learned how to accept them. December 10th, 1945, marked a day that would echo through courtrooms and history books across the world. Tokyo was cold, its skies washed in winter gray, yet the city pulsed with a sense of reckoning. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East was in full session, gathering evidence of atrocities committed across the Pacific. Generals, officers, prison guards, medics, and soldiers stood accused of unimaginable crimes. But on this day, something extraordinary was about to occur. For the first time, a comfort woman survivor would take the stand. Her name was Kim Yong-suk. The same young woman who had once trembled at her own reflection now stood in a pressed uniform, with her hair neatly styled, hands shaking slightly but eyes filled with a quiet, unbreakable determination. She had undergone weeks of preparation, not just rehearsals of testimony, but resilience training, emotional grounding, endless reassurance. Each Salon session had rebuilt another layer of confidence. Each encouraging word from Reeves, Chen, and O'Sullivan had fortified her spirit for this moment. When she entered the courtroom, cameras clicked. Prosecutors whispered. Even hardened officers straightened in their seats. She was escorted to the stand, her steps slow but steady. Reeves watched from the gallery with her heart pounding. Lieutenant Chen sat rigidly, ready to interpret and emotionally anchor her. Dr. Harper kept her hands clasped tightly, silently praying the girl would not lose herself to the weight of the moment. The judge signaled for the proceedings to begin. Yong-suk took a breath and began to speak. Her Korean words wavered at first, but soon found strength. She described her village, her abduction at 15, the station she was taken to, the rules, the punishments, the name she was forced to use, the language she was forbidden to speak. She spoke of the girls who died beside her, of the ones who disappeared, of the ones who endured by surrendering their very identities. She recounted the psychological warfare, the erasure of culture, the stripping of dignity. She described the exact structure of the comfort station, the ranking system, the threats made daily, and when she spoke of the torture used to force obedience, a murmur swept through the courtroom. Prosecutors leaned forward. Military officials whispered in disbelief. Reporters scribbled frantically. What she revealed was not merely abuse, it was an organized system of dehumanization deliberately crafted and implemented across nations. By the time her testimony ended, silence gripped the room. Even the clicking of cameras had stopped. Then, slowly, applause rose. It was not loud. It was not triumphant. It was reverent, respectful, painful. Yong-suk stepped down, tears glistening in her eyes. Lieutenant Chen caught her in a trembling embrace before escorting her outside. Reeves followed them, her own eyes burning. That night, more survivors volunteered to testify, some quietly, some with trembling courage. They realized their voices, once stolen, had become weapons for justice. Testimonies across Asia followed. Women from Korea, China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, and Burma came forward. Their stories formed a tapestry of suffering, but also of unimaginable resilience. International courts took notice. Legal scholars rewrote definitions of wartime sexual crimes. For the first time, systematic sexual violence was recognized not just as cruelty, but as a prosecutable war crime. Back in the Philippine rehabilitation compound, life continued to evolve. The beauty salon became more than a place of transformation. It became a sanctuary, a classroom, a gathering hall. Women learned skills there. Some studied nursing, others bookkeeping. A few discovered they had natural talent in beauty therapy itself. The program, once mocked as frivolous, became a model of holistic trauma recovery replicated across the Pacific Theater. Maria Santos emerged as a visionary. With military support, she began planning the first Filipino support center for survivors of sexual violence. She dreamed of a safe house with counselors, nurses, and legal advocates, a place where no woman would ever again be punished for crimes committed against her. Reeves encouraged her fiercely, calling her one of the bravest women she had ever met. Meanwhile, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt continued her advocacy from Washington and abroad. Through diplomatic channels, she pushed passionately for permanent immigration pathways for comfort women survivors. Her voice carried power in rooms where others hesitated. She insisted that nations must take responsibility for the victims of war crimes, not abandon them. In late December 1945, her efforts paid off. Emergency legislation passed in the United States, allowing comfort women survivors to immigrate as refugees under special protection. Veterans groups, women's organizations, and trauma specialists had rallied behind the bill. Letters poured in from the public, and the world shifted, if only slightly, toward compassion. Sunoke was among the first to accept resettlement. From the moment she stepped into the American transport vessel, she carried both grief and hope. She still clutched her brother's letter. She still whispered apologies to a family that rejected her. But she also carried a notebook with English phrases she had been practicing. She carried the memory of Reeves holding her as she cried. She carried the image of her reflection in a mirror for the first time in years, with hair brushed neatly and eyes that looked human again. By early 1946, the program in the Philippines expanded even further. More survivors were discovered across the islands and brought in for care. Soldiers helped repair roofs. Nurses taught hygiene practices. Women crafted small ornaments and traded them for extra food supplies. The compound was no longer a place of despair. It had become a village of recovery. June 15, 1946 marked the official closure of the Comfort Women Rehabilitation Program. Reeves stood on the balcony as the last group of survivors prepared to depart. Some boarded ships to America. Others returned to transformed communities. A few remained in the Philippines to help build new support centers. They hugged. They cried. They promised to find each other again. When the gates finally closed, the converted mess hall stood silent. The salon chairs were empty. The scented soaps were packed away. But the impact of what happened there would echo for decades. Reeves closed her notebook one last time, knowing she had witnessed something revolutionary. She had not only treated survivors, she had helped restore their humanity. Years later, research institutions studied the program. Psychologists published books. Legal scholars used survivor testimonies to modernize international humanitarian law. And across continents, women spoke their truths because others had spoken before them. The legacy began with a single frightened girl sitting in a chair of salvaged aircraft parts, rediscovering her face in a mirror, and that legacy would never fade.